plant trees right. That's the focus tonight. And you can select the best tree. You can plant it in the best spot for that tree. But if we don't plant it correctly, that tree may suffer. So that's what I'll cover tonight. And I got to do a little ad first. You know, we all know that trees are vital community assets, but not just any old tree. Our communities need tree canopy. And by that, I mean tall shade trees, long-lived, relatively long-lived, and weather-ready trees. There is a trend to planting smaller or shorter trees, but that tree canopy is so important for making our communities climate-ready and weather-ready that I'm going to put in a plug here to plant those tall shade trees. So we need that diverse forest, like Nicole said last week. We don't want those monocultures. You know, we don't want to plant too much of one genus. Quality shade trees, good structure. You get good structure by starting with a quality tree and pruning it correctly. And then it's very important to plant it right. A well-planted tree and maintained tree, research has shown, will grow faster and live longer and have fewer problems over the course of its lifetime. So that's what I'm going to talk about tonight. How do we plant it correctly? Well, the first thing I'm going to tell you is these are the mistakes you need to avoid. Okay, they're in red. So no, don't do this. And I share this because a lot of times people will ask me a question, I answer it, and they say, well, if I'd only known I shouldn't have done that, I wouldn't have done it. So that's why sometimes I'll point out these are common mistakes and I'll cover how to do it correctly. But planting too deep is probably one of the most common mistakes we make. Amending that backfill soil of the hole. Stomping on the soil as you backfill the hole. You don't want to compact that soil. And you got to be careful about those augers. You don't want to damage the structure either. Hint, hint, Randy. Nicole, you'll get them on the right track. Not dealing with or preventing girdling roots. Pruning at planting for the most part. And staking too high, too tightly, and for too long. Not removing those wires, tags, wrapping strings. They can girdle those trees. They seem pretty small, trees seem pretty big, but they can girdle those trees. Mulching too deep and piling it against the trunk. You've probably heard this numerous times. Under or overwatering. And fertilizing with nitrogen at planting, usually. These are the things we want to avoid. So planting depth. I'm going to make a statement about planting depth. If a tree is planted at the same depth it was in the container you bought it in, or in its ball and its burlap, and the soil is loosened beneath that root ball, where you sit the root ball, chances are very good that you planted it too deep. So, and this is what I tell that to people, they're like, really? Kind of scratch their head. So what we're aiming for is, we're not aiming for this. If you look at trees that are established and they look like this, a telephone pole going into the ground, then that tree was planted too deep. So there's no what we call root flare or trunk taper. It's not visible. If you see a tree with this nice root flare right here, trunk taper, that tree was planted at the correct depth. And that's what we're aiming for. So when you walk around town, you go for your walk, you're in a park, you're in your own yard, check out those trees. And you can tell pretty quickly which ones are too deep and which ones were planted at the correct depth. So how do we achieve that? How do we plant it at the correct depth? Well, this picture, we never plant it with the container on. That's not what this picture is showing. But some people will, as they're digging the hole, they'll keep putting the container down in the hole until they make sure it's as deep as the container. And what I said earlier, if you plant at the same depth in the container, it might be too deep. And always remove all containers and as much of the ball and burlap as you can. So, key, don't just plant at the same depth the tree was in the container. Wait to ever dig that hole until you locate that root taper or the first lateral root. And chances are you might need to remove some soil from the top of that root ball to do that. So this is a great picture from the Nebraska Forest Service. And this shows a tree, I suspect it was probably balled in burlap, but it might have been in a container. But when they started pulling away the soil to find that first lateral root, and that's where that root flare occurs, this is how deep it was in the container or in the ball and burlap. Now, there may not be a lot of trees that are that deep, but as little as just even a couple of inches can cause problems for that tree. So always don't ever dig the hole. First, take the ball out of, kind of roll back a little bit of the burlap, take it out of the plastic container, take your hands and push away that soil. You're going to hit some fine roots. You probably have to tear and break away a few roots, but keep digging until you find that first lateral root. And then plant it so that root flare, so you can see it just at or slightly above soil grade. And that first lateral root is right below the soil line. Now, and even in a heavier clay soil, they recommend planting, you know, so that root flares as much as 2 or 3 inches above grade. So here's that black oak I planted last, I think it was black oak, maybe this is the yellow one that I planted last year. And you can see that when the trees are smaller, that root flare is kind of difficult to see. But you can see right here where it kind of slowly starts to flare out where that first lateral root is. And that should be, the tree's pretty much planted. I put a little, maybe a dab of soil on there, and then I put my mulch on there. And that's a correct planting depth. So just another diagram here. Again, find that taper first. And probably what I don't like about this diagram is it doesn't look to me like they've rolled back a little bit of that burlap to look for that taper. And only then dig your hole, dig a wide hole. I don't know how many people will dig 5 times the diameter, but at least 1.5 to 2 times the diameter, because those tree roots, they grow outward. So you want to loosen the soil on the outside to encourage that root growth outward. And then always set the root ball on firm, undisturbed soil. If you end up accidentally planting too deep, it's a good idea. You can stop then. Go in there and, yeah, not too much, but you want to firm up that soil, because if you loosen the soil underneath after you plant it, it's going to settle. And it'll end up being planted too deep, and as little as 2 inches can cause issues. And then I had talked about a mistake being, you know, not backfilling with the same soil. This was an old recommendation that, you know, dig that hole and then put this really nice, I call it cushy soil, you know, something with a lot of compost. You're not supposed to do that. That tree has to grow in that soil for the rest of its life. So if you make that hole just a little bit too cushy, I call it, those roots, especially if it's a heavier clay soil and you get kind of a glazed side here when you're digging, which you should scarify that so it's not like that. But those roots are going to hit that clay and they might just keep growing in a circle. Okay, you can also create what we call soil interfaces. So if that soil and if the soil texture in the hole is different than the soil surrounding soil, you can have issues with drainage. So we've seen issues where the hole itself, when you're watering, it just ends up being a bowl of water, and that's too much water for tree roots. So hopefully that's pretty clear on tree planting. I probably spend a little more time on that than anything, because planting too deep is probably one of the biggest mistakes made, and it leads to trees just not thriving over the course of their lifetime. Again, and I'm just going to emphasize to keep in mind that roots do grow outward up to and often well beyond the tree's height. If they don't run into a house or some other structure, they do grow outward. And 90% of the water absorbing roots are in that upper 8 to 12 inches of soil. So I think if we keep that in mind, that helps us with tree planting. So next, deal with or prevent those stem girdling roots. We have to have an acronym for everything. So SGRs is what these are called. And these are very common with trees that are grown in containers that have plastic containers. Those roots start growing in a circle. They continue to do so. As they press, as the root grows larger, as the trunk grows larger, that it compresses that tissue, that trunk tissue, and it does restrict that flow of water and nutrients. We have to keep in mind that the cambium of the tree, where most of the water, nutrients, the photosynthate products from the trees, the carbohydrates and sugars, most of that is moving in a fairly thin layer right underneath that bark. So it doesn't take much to restrict that with the stem girdling root. So how do we avoid that? Well, if you buy something in a plastic container, I always kind of cringe when I show this, but they do recommend cutting those encircling roots. Okay, this is Eric Berg, a past Nebraska Forest Service. He was up doing a demonstration with some tree care people, and he took a saw and he squared up that root ball. Okay, or if it's smaller, you can kind of take your fingers and tease out those roots. But it's stressful for this plant. It is stressful, but it's better than having a stem girdling root that's going to have a negative effect on that tree, and it can even increase the risk of wind throw, those trees failing in windstorms. So we want weather-ready trees. Or even better yet, and this is what Randy and Nicole were talking about. They're talking about planting trees that were growing in a grow bag, or even starting with bare root trees. Grow bags, basically they have air holes in them. So as those roots are growing, the roots grow through those air holes, and they're air pruned. So they grow through rather than hitting the side and growing in a circle. And you just get this very nice fibrous root system. So they're not as readily available yet as the container growing trees, or the plastic containers, but they are becoming more readily available. If you can find one, we do highly recommend these. So I'm glad to hear that Randy and Nicole are going to be planting those. Okay, so that pruning comment, minimal, if any, pruning at planting. I told Randy that I was happy to hear him call me a young buck, because 38 years ago was when I started in Extension. And when I graduated from college, at that time, they recommended pruning at planting. The idea was you wanted to make up for lost roots. So prune off some of the top to balance it out. Well, that's incorrect. We no longer recommend that. And the reason being is those branches have a lot of stored food in them. The branches produce leaves for photosynthesis, and all that is needed to help that tree recover from transplanting and to promote root growth. And some things we don't think about often is plant hormones. There are plant hormones that help the plant to grow and do different functions. But for example, gibberellins, I should say, are produced in the roots, and they help top growth. They promote top growth. And there's auxins that are produced in the top part of the plant and the branches that help promote root growth. So this often occurs in plants with those plant hormones. They're produced in one part of the plant, but they help induce growth in another part of the plant. So if you're pruning off too much of the top at planting, you're removing those auxins, which are needed for promoting that root growth. So very little pruning, minimal, if any. It also avoids a wound response during planting stress. We always say don't prune plants during stress, don't prune trees during stress, so drought stress, but planting stress is another time. So the tree has to respond to that wound. It has to use energy to respond to that wound. And again, it's during a stress period, so it may not do it as well, and it may not seal off that wound as well. Plus, you're taking energy away from root growth. When I said minimal, if any, if you need to do any pruning, it might be to remove a double leader. If you look at this picture here, we have a double leader. Okay, you want to get rid of that sooner rather than later, because double leaders are just going to cause problems, and that tree will not be a weather-ready tree if you leave that double leader, and I'll show you a picture in a minute. So you can remove that at planting, or you could remove it at least within that first year or year later. But ideally get rid of it so you don't forget about it. Okay, any dead branches, any damaged branches, obviously we want to remove those. Most of that is kind of taken care of at the nursery before you buy it. One thing, we want to leave the lower limbs as long as possible, or until they're about 1 inch in diameter. So it's kind of an instinct. You plant this tree and snip off those younger branches, right? Because they're going to get in the way of mowing. They're going to get head clearance. But you want to leave them on as long as possible, because research has shown, again, they help increase trunk caliper. And I mean, ideally, if the branches, even these lower branches, if they'd been left a little longer, that would have been great. You're going to get a little bit bigger trunk caliper a little sooner. And if you've got that shading, it definitely helps to reduce sun scald as well. So remove issues such as a double leader, so you don't end up with this, but leave those lower limbs. So this is actually a picture of a tree in my dad's yard. And I'm waiting for one of these branches to go on the house. He lives in northern North Dakota, where there's lots of wind and snow and ice. But you can see those two trunks kept growing together. If there's a pressure, there's a crack form, moisture gets in there, it looks like there's some decay there. So when we see a lot of double leaders You want to get rid of them in the first, at least the first year at planting, the first year or 2 or 3 of life. Stake trees correctly. So this is probably one of the newer staking methods, where you just take a pole or a 2x4 or a sturdy stake and you insert it in the ground at an angle and tie it off. Okay. So staking right is only if needed. Unfortunately, in Nebraska, it's very windy, so it is often needed for the first year of the tree's life, especially if you start with a little bit larger tree. However, 1.5-inch caliper is the ideal tree size to start with. The larger the tree, the longer it takes to recover from transplant shock, and actually it grows a little slower. So if you start with a little smaller tree to begin with, it'll catch up and surpass those bigger trees eventually. You want to stake low on the tree. Remember that staking is not to keep the trunk from growing in the wind or blowing in the wind, okay? You want the trunk to move with the wind. The whole goal of staking is to prevent that root ball from shifting in the soil and tearing those new young tender roots that are trying to establish. Okay, so as low on the tree, that's why they like this method here, just inserting a stake diagonally and tying it off as low as you can on the trunk. Now I'm not saying you can't still use the 3, 2 stakes on either side, or even 3 if needed, but the rule of thumb is, if possible, try to stake no higher than 1/3 up the height of the tree. So about 2/3 of the trunk is moving with the wind, is a general rule of thumb. Again, you want to allow that top 2/3 to move with the wind. That movement of the tree has to blow and bend with the wind its entire life. And if it's doing it from the very beginning, that helps it to lay down wood, develop wood and lay down wood that strengthens that trunk and helps it to blow and bend with that wind its entire life. It also stimulates those growth hormones that I talked about earlier. You want to use a wide material where you're attaching the stake to the trunk, kind of a wide flat material, and it is tied off. I'll show you another picture where it is tied off in like a figure 8. And you want to remove staking after 1 year. Okay, ideally, there may be a very few exceptions. If a large tree is moved with a tree spade, remember you're losing 80% of the roots, at least in those situations. So we don't like that. We don't always recommend it, but it is done and it can be done, and you might need to stake a little longer. But most trees that are planted remove that staking material after 1 year. Here's another example. This was a picture I took at UNO. You can kind of see where they use that staking method. And you can see here where the band is tied in, kind of a figure 8. And you don't make sure this pole is not rubbing against the trunk. You don't want to cause damage to that trunk. Okay. But we definitely want to avoid this. I still see this frequently, where somebody takes a post or a pole or a steel post and they tie it right up against that trunk as tight as they can to the very tip of that trunk. Because boy, they're going to make sure that tree grows straight. They don't want it to move at all. And you remove the stake and the heavy wind comes along and snaps it off. Now this tree didn't even wait for the stake to be removed. But I suspect this tree snapped here in the wind. Maybe it was ice or snow, because it just had not developed the ability to blow and bend with the wind. And I saw this in my own county. I had a gentleman call and he said a wind went through and all of his pines snapped at the exact same spot, just like this. And when I went out there, he had stakes on them. Okay, mulching those trees correctly. I know you've probably heard this. If you've listened to many extension talks, you've seen and heard this many times, but this is correct. As large of a mulch ring as you can have. Most of them are 2 feet, and that's better than nothing because it does protect the tree from lawnmowers and it protects the tree from the weed trimmers. But for overall tree growth and tree health and root health, the larger the better. So I always tell people at least 4 to 6 feet, but you can go 8, 12 feet if you wanted. The tree will love you for it. So a large ring, and as you can see, it needs to be very shallow. It's only about no more than 2 to 4 inches deep. I guess I'll get in here. Not too deep. It reduces soil oxygen. Tree roots need oxygen just as much as they need water. So you have too deep of a layer, as in this picture, you're going to restrict oxygen exchange with the soil, and that's going to have a negative effect on tree root growth. And a lot of times those roots will grow up into that mulch itself, And they dry out in summer, they winter kill in winter. They're fine, tender root hairs in many cases, and trees are always growing those and losing them. But you're going to lose everything that grows in there, up in there eventually. You want your roots to grow down in the soil. So again, the rule of thumb, when you plant, about 1 inch deep on top of the root ball, because we don't want it piled up against the trunk. Okay, it holds moisture against that trunk, and you can get some decay over time, or you get some other issues with that base of that trunk. And then beyond that, about 2 to 4 inches deep is ideal. And organic mulch, that's what we prefer. We definitely prefer that organic mulch over those weed mats and rocks. And not piled against the trunk. I mentioned the trunk decay. They're also rodent homes. So voles love to live in there during the winter and gnaw on the tree bark. Okay, watering, water right. Too much is as lethal as too little water. And I see both. I see people watering too much and I see people watering too little. But both of them are incorrect. And that's, again, as I mentioned earlier, plants require oxygen and water pretty much in equal amounts. And oxygen is absorbed by the root hairs from the soil. You know, we all know plants produce oxygen, they give off oxygen, but plants cannot use the oxygen they produce and give off. I suppose eventually they use it if the oxygen exchange with the soil. But the oxygen they use is all absorbed by root hairs in the soil. And that's why overwatering can be lethal to a plant, to any plant. So for newly planted trees, you know, everybody, when they call, they're like, well, how many gallons a week should I put on? It'd be nice to be able to give them a set number, and I kind of do, but you really kind of have to know your soil. But the goal is consistent watering, keeping that soil consistently moist, not too wet, not too dry, through the fall. You know, ideally, you want to do this, you know, through September and October, because a lot of roots are, especially if you're planting now in September and October, which is a great time to plant most trees. But even a trees planted last spring, this year especially, as dry and hot as it's been, it is important to keep that soil moist, not too wet, not too dry, throughout the whole fall. And do it for at least 2 years for a tree. And then if you get a year like this, water your trees, even if they are 10 years old or older. It helps to know your soil. Obviously, if you have a sandy soil, you're going to have to water a little more frequently and put on a little less water each time. If you have a heavier clay soil, you probably won't need to water as frequently. You might need to water a couple of days in a row to moisten the soil deep enough. So water when the soil is beginning to dry out. You can check it with a probe, you know, Phillips screwdriver, something like that. Okay, when you go down so far, it's getting hard, it's dry, it's time to water. And your goal, your aim is to moisten that soil about 8 to 10 inches deep, because remember that 90% of those root-absorbing roots, nutrient and water-absorbing roots are in that upper 8 to 10 inches of soil. And make sure you're moistening the soil outside the root ball, okay? Because we want to encourage those roots to grow outward. Roots grow where there's oxygen and water and pore space, okay? And a little bit larger pore space. And sometimes if we auger the soil too much, sorry, Randy, you can break down that soil structure, make it too fine, and you lose some of those larger pore spaces. Okay, there is a rule. I recently read this one rule, and it seemed pretty accurate, especially with the two small trees I planted last year and I've been watering all summer, is to provide water at a rate of about 5 gallons for every inch of trunk diameter, measured at about 6 inches above soil. But again, that's just a general rule. Your soil type, the weather, so many things, there are so many factors in there, but just not too little, not too much. Okay, and as a rule, we do say to avoid fertilizing, especially with nitrogen, at planting time. Okay, a lot of people say, oh, I'm going to plant, I'm going to put on lots of fertilizer, I'm going to make this tree grow as fast as I can. That's not a good thing. We do not fertilize trees at planting, in few exceptions. If construction has removed the topsoil, which unfortunately they often do, it should be replaced. But if they didn't, you might need to fertilize. Or if a soil test determines that nutrients are needed. But know that most Nebraska soils have adequate fertility for trees, okay? So even established trees, larger established trees, very few trees need supplemental fertilization, except in a few cases. And landscape trees that are growing in a lawn and the lawn is fertilized, they do not need extra fertilization. They probably are receiving enough and maybe too much from lawn fertilization. So you don't want to fertilize with nitrogen at planting time. It's a stress period, and we don't want to apply nitrogen to any plant when it's stressed. Too much nitrogen, unless the stress is caused by a lack of nitrogen. Fast release nitrogen sources, which is what's mostly readily available out there, can burn those new young tender roots. Nitrogen at planting can force that canopy growth or vegetative growth, the top growth at the expense of root growth. Okay, so these are some of the reasons why we do not recommend fertilization, especially with nitrogen at planting. What about root starters? You buy a tree, you're asked if you need a root starter, or you're often just sold a root starter. So I have a lot of question marks there. Most root starters supply phosphorus, okay? And phosphorus is very important to root growth and other plant functions. However, phosphorus is not very mobile in the environment. It adheres to soil particles. It doesn't leach out of soil. It's not lost to the atmosphere like nitrogen typically is. So it's pretty stable in the environment. And most soils we find, at least especially landscape soils where you're planting into a turf or something like that, has plenty of phosphorus. And people will say, well, is it going to hurt anything? Yet too much phosphorus can cause problems. Too much phosphorus in a soil can prevent tree roots from taking up other micronutrients like iron and zinc. So too much can be bad. And then of course there's issues too with if you get soil erosion or you get soil moving off that property where that phosphorus can leach into water bodies and cause issues with water quality. So most of the research shows that there's just not a lot of benefit to using those root starters, especially in the fall when the soils are warm. You're going to get active root growth. Maybe might be some benefit to using them in the spring when the soils are cold, when they're wet. That phosphorus might not be quite as readily available. But as a general rule of thumb, depends on the soil, but most soils you probably do not need those root starters. So, okay, wow, I zipped through that a little quicker than I thought I would, but hopefully we have lots of questions. I love this. I've been using this at the end of any of my tree presentations. Extension Master Gardener Facebook page, the grandiloquent word of the day. Sitherism. So I hope you'll all plant tall shade trees, quality trees, something that's not very common, so we don't have that monoculture of too many of one kind of genus, and then plant them correctly so you can enjoy sitherism.